good evening, Soundside Church. Pastor Aaron coming to you and to your community group in particular. Tonight, you should have read a portion of Scripture from Ruth, chapter 1, verses 6 through 18. And you would have read some very, very beautiful words in there that we're going to come back to in our discussion. But before we do, I want to just kind of tell you a little bit about what we're dealing with tonight. You see, when I first sat down to prepare tonight's discussion, and originally when I thought through the book of Ruth, I thought, at some point we're going to have to deal with the issue of race. Multiple times in the book of Ruth, Ruth is specified as Ruth the Moabite, or depending upon your translation, Ruth the Moabitess. The inspired narrator wants us to consider her according to her ethnicity for some reason. And so my thought was, we really kind of need to deal with race or racial issues here. But the more I studied the issue, the more I looked into the scriptures here, the more I realized, that's not really what's going on here. Bible study, good Bible study often spoils good sermons and good lessons, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon your take on it. The truth is, our conception of race, what we think of today, is really more of a modern idea. The idea that people can be grouped according to their most obvious physical characteristics and considered as a distinct people group it's very modern. In fact, here in the United States, it's only a few hundred years old. In the early 1600s, here in the colonies, slavery did exist, and there were African slaves. But there were also white European slaves. In fact, the idea of white was actually brand new and only became developed as it referred to the most privileged parts of society. A person could have skin that looked like mine and not be considered white. I know that's strange, but that's the way it was. Well, the slavery of that time wasn't quite what it came to be in the centuries that followed. Slavery of that time was more of an indentured servitude. Slaves could actually earn their freedom. Children born to slaves could themselves be free. But after a period of time, it became more economically profitable to be able to keep slaves their entire lives and to, have children born into slavery that they're just destined to be slaves. But the slave owners of that time had to find a way to justify it. And one of the most obvious ways to justify it was through observing physical characteristics and grouping people according to their appearance. Now, people of that time, who of course knew their Bibles, knew that God had created all humanity from one pair of ancestors. Likewise, people who knew their Bibles knew that the gospel should be included for all. And so in order to justify and maintain this race-based slavery, unscrupulous students of Scripture were forced to go to the Scriptures and find some very strange interpretations of the Bible in order to justify race-based slavery. So that what we find is this modern conception of race based upon physical characteristics really came as a way to justify the practice of slavery, not the other way around. In fact, as one author has said, race is the father of racism, not the other way around. And if that feels like a really weird concept to you, something you may not have heard before, I don't blame you, but it is a modern idea. And for more information, I would suggest you pick up this book, The Forging of Races by Colin Kidd, put out by Cambridge Press. He develops the idea very clearly and shows how people twisted the scriptures in unbelievable ways in order to justify the conception that Black Africans were some form of inferior humanity and that their proper place was in chains. Thank God that belief no longer persists. But that does bring us back to the book of Ruth. You see, when we read that Ruth is a Moabite, our minds instantly think, that's her race. That was not a concept in the days of the judges, in the days of Ruth, the idea of race, the idea of family, the idea of tribe, the idea of clan. All of those were absolutely ideas that people would have had. In fact, Ruth the Moabite, God's people would have known where Moabites came from. As early as Genesis chapter 19, we read that the Moabites were actually descended from Lot, Abraham's nephew. In a very grotesque way, his daughters committed incest with him, and one of the children that was born from that horrible union was, in fact, Moab, who became the father of the Moabites. The other one was Ben-Ami, who became the father of the Ammonites. And those two would actually become rivals with Israel in their history. In fact, as Israel was making its way to the Promised Land, they encountered the Moabites who had already settled in their land, and Israel tried to walk through Moab's land, and Moab said, no, you're not coming in through here. So Israel actually walked all the way around Moab's land to get to Canaan. Nevertheless, the king of Moab, a man by the name of Balak, hired a prophet by the name of Balaam to curse Israel because he saw the threat that they posed on his borders. Of course, God wouldn't let Balaam do that. God turned the curse into a blessing. And so Balak and Balaam concocted another plot to get God to curse Israel by introducing idolatry. And they had some major problems that led to armed conflict. Later on, when Israel settled in the land, they displeased God. They went and served various idols and false gods. And God allowed the king of Moab, at that time, a man by the name of Eglon, to lead his armies to conquer Israel. And when Israel finally cried out and repented of their sins, God brought a judge by the name of Ehud, who freed the children of Israel from the Moabites, actually in a pretty cool, violent way that you can read about in Judges chapter 3. All that is to say this: by the time we get to the book of Ruth and we find Ruth the Moabite, we find that this young lady has been identified as a member of a clan that is both an ancient and recent enemy to God's people of Israel. The issue at hand isn't one of race and racism. The issue at hand is one of what we would call immigration. Now, I don't want us to discuss tonight America's immigration policies. In fact, if you find yourself discussing that, you are off track. Please bring it back to the scriptures. Nevertheless, what is at stake here is what it means to treat someone who is a foreigner, someone who is different from us, someone who doesn't enjoy the same privileges as us. And what we find is the Bible has a lot to say about the foreigner amongst us. Ruth was a Moabite, had nothing to do with her race, had everything to do with her clan and her tribe and her family and her gods, which, as you may have noticed when you read, were exactly what was at stake when she chose to follow Naomi back to Bethlehem. We've got a great discussion in store for us tonight, and I hope we learn a few things about how God would have us treat the people around us.